Good. I'm Sarah Posner, Senior Editor at Religion Dispatches, and I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Anthea Butler, who teaches religion at the University of Pennsylvania and is a contributing editor to Religion Dispatches and a frequent guest on MSNBC. So I'm very happy to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. Well, we could do this forever anyway, so this is just a good
Well,
time
we're going to talk about religion and sex, so that shouldn't take long.
Okay. No, not at all. Not at all. I don't think there's anything to say about that.
So, I'm just back from Dearborn, Michigan, where I was yesterday. I spoke on a panel that was put together by the Arab American Institute and some local groups in Dearborn. It was set up to counter this conference, I say that very loosely, that was set up by Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer and the Stop the Islamicization of America people.
Right.
And that conference was oriented around this claim that they have that this recent, obviously very tragic murder of a young woman in the Detroit area, Jessica McTodd, was an honor killing. When the prosecutor in the case has told the press that it was not an honor killing. It was sort of just a terrible, straight up murder of someone by her father.
Yeah.
It was an interesting day because it was, what you saw there was the mobilization of a community in opposition to this conference that was organized really just to make the claim that Islam is a violent religion and the honor killings in the supposed honor killings in the United States are emblematic of that. And the reason I bring this up is that Spencer told a reporter for the Detroit Free Press that he very much liked Mona Eltahawy's piece in Foreign Policy. And that is not intended to be a slam on Eltahawy because I think she would be I think she would be appalled to be being praised by Robert Spencer. But I think I bring it up as a way of delving into this conversation about the foreign policy sex issue and Mona's piece in particular, because it did raise a lot of controversy from all sorts of different directions.
Yeah, it did.
But in particular, the idea that, I think that her piece struck a different kind of chord with lots of different kind of people. And I think that somebody like Robert Spencer would exploit a piece like that to say, see, Islam, it does hate women. It is a religion that's inherently opposed to religion, even though Mona doesn't say that in the piece. I mean, the piece is more like the culture of the Arab world. The piece is titled, Why Do They Hate Us? And it's been criticized from the left for being oversimplified and reduced to this very sort of broad brush generalization.
Yeah.
But it's interesting the way it provoked these different sorts of reactions.
No, absolutely. And one of the things I was thinking about the piece is, and I was actually talking to another Islamicist about this yesterday, actually my chair, Jamal Alias, and he was saying, I found it very interesting that the first thing that everybody fussed about in all the rebuttals was the image of the woman with the hijab and the shtor painted on her, when the image of the woman being dragged in the street in one of the protests in Cairo was not commented about at all. And I thought that sort of says a lot about what people's reactions are to the article. But let me take sort of the front piece of this first, and I'm going to come back to the image later. What I found really interesting about the article was that somebody like Robert Spencer could say he's for it because it hits every button of a Western sensibility about what people think. An average person who doesn't know a lot about Islam thinks about Islam. It's demeaning towards women. They hate women. It's all the hyperbole that you absolutely want to push back on the kinds of things that can and do happen to women in Muslim countries. On the other hand, I think Mona's piece was great, but I also think that it did not look at the complexities of what happens in each one of these Muslim countries. I mean, to talk about Saudi Arabia, for instance, where women can't drive, vis-a-vis a country like Tunis, where a woman could be a police person and spit on the guy who actually was the first person to immolate himself, which started the Arab Spring. That's a real range about what women can do in the Muslim world. Okay, so the article, while I think it had the right heart and the right piece, and I would never criticize her for it because it's her right to write it that way, I think what happened is that you end up having these unintended consequences of people who really don't like Islam, like the Pamela Gellers and the Roberts of this world, that could say, oh, yeah, see, this is the reason why we need to stomp this out. We need to this is a bad religion. This is a religion that abuses women, and we should fight it every day.
But in her defense, I think that was...
No, it's not what she wanted at all. No, I completely agree with
the opposite of what she wanted.
It's opposite of what she wanted, but that's what I mean by unintended consequences. What you get...
Well, I think it might be a product of writing such a broad piece. I mean, it just seemed like perhaps, focusing on Egypt in particular, which she has, unfortunately, very personal knowledge of, it just seemed like it seemed like such a broad brush, and in a way, it had unintended consequences, like someone like Robert Spencer praising it, or saying that he liked it at least. And then, but perhaps an intended consequence that everyone is talking about it.
Exactly.
And I think that sometimes the goal of these overly broad pieces is to just spark a conversation, because a piece like that, however many words it was, a few thousand words, of course, cannot capture the entire experience of women living in Muslim countries all around the world.
Yeah, no.
Although I think she was focused on Arab countries. But, and so I think that it did have that effect. It was probably one of the most talked about pieces last week in terms of being blogged about and tweeted about. But there was a lot of backlash from feminist Muslim women who felt that she just overgeneralized and failed to portray the broader picture of what goes on in terms of women on the ground, feminist activism on the ground in these countries. But maybe it will serve the purpose of raising people's awareness of those things just because it prompted people to talk about it.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, I think one of the things, what I wish the nuance could have been, the other piece of the nuance when I read it was that I thought, this would have been great for my women in religion class this past semester. It's unfortunately was over by the time the piece came out. But to also just sort of nuance it in some different ways to talk about what feminism means. How do you, talk about gender in particular? What are some, if she had been able to get into some of the more, technicalities of the religion, I think that would have been really good too. And look at the hadiths, that speak for and sort of against women in certain kinds of ways. But I'm glad it was talked about. What I do fear is this. It's on the one hand a really mentioned article, but it doesn't push us further unless somebody really wants to start to have some sustained conversation about women in the Muslim world, period. Okay, and I think that's happening in a lot of different places. I think about the documentary Saving Face that was about women who had been having acid thrown on them in Pakistan, and a doctor's work in trying to reconstruct their faces. These are different kinds of sort of localized things that we could talk about in a particular context about how women get helped. To only speak about how awful it is doesn't also show the kinds of people who are on the ground doing things. And to Mona's credit, she did mention some of those in the piece. But I thought the other interesting piece about this was on the Melissa Harris Perry show this past week, she was, they put Mona on Eltahawy with Layla Ahmed. And Layla was speaking from, a very, sort of a revered perspective in terms of being the person who really got started to talk about women in Islam and gender.
Right, and she's written a sort of seminal book on that
exactly.
topic.
And she, cautioned Mona too at the same time. And so I think what would be the really good conversations for those of us on the outside, this is a conversation for us to sort of think about the ways in which we write and think about women's agency, and not just Islam, but in all these religions. Can we, completely say that, why do they hate us? Well, the same religion, that women, you may say women hate, why do they hate us in Islam? Why they hate us in these Muslim countries, but there are women who are very devout Muslims. And I think what's a more interesting sort of conversation to have is that how do women sustain themselves in the midst of these religious traditions that are very authoritarian and patriarchal? And we can think about that with Catholicism. We can think about that in Protestantism. There's a myriad of religious traditions that this happens in. And sometimes women are the ones who are also complicit in carrying out these structures of oppression. So that's the kind of piece that I think was sort of missing from Mona's thing, is that, sometimes, yes, it is that bad. It is completely as bad as you say it is. But there's also some other kinds of structural issues that are happening underneath that an effort like a foreign policy article just can't get to. It's only, a 3,000, 5,000 word piece.
It wasn't, and also it wasn't really an article. It wasn't really a religion piece.
No, it wasn't at all. That's the other piece about it too. And that I think is that also brings a problem. It's sort of the problematic thing between the culture and the religion, right? And so how do you write about something that's a cultural thing, but also to speak to what the really religious prohibitions are? I think that's also very important for people to understand. So the Pam Gellers of the world can't just parade everything with a very broad brush. I mean, she will anyway, but it would be helpful if you could nuance that argument some kind of way. And it might have been nice to have her piece alongside somebody like a Layla Ahmed who could come at it from this religion perspective as well.
Well, and also, of course, the oppression of women is not limited to Muslim or Arab countries.
No, it is not. No. Not at all.
So, I thought it was interesting because I guess, from when I saw that foreign policy was having a sex issue, I was sort of excited, not in a Purian sense, but in a sense that perhaps I thought that they would talk about some of the, more global issues regarding women's rights. I mean, there were other articles, but of course Mona's article got all of the attention. But I do think that there's an exportation of American religious right mores about sex and sexuality that do get exported around the world. Yeah, no, that's and that was something that I thought that they would tap into a little bit, since it's foreign policy. Talks about the magazine that talks about American foreign policy. But, of course, I mean, I'm far be it from me to criticize a publication for not touching on all the things that I wanted to
Exactly. I'm just happy that they're actually talking about
something
like
that
this.
I know how that is, because, people will say to me, why don't you write about
X? Why do you do this?
X, Y, and Z? And I'm thinking, well, that's not what I was writing about.
Yeah.
But, anyway, but just to use that as a segue, perhaps, to talking about some of the, war on women, war on sex and sexuality, whatever you want to call it, here in the United States. And so this past weekend also, it seemed like there was a lot of things happening this weekend. So there were these rallies, I don't know how many of them across the country.
I think about 44. I think that was the number.
44. Yeah. And who was the audience? So these were these rallies in opposition to the war on women.
Yeah, United against the war on United against the war on women. So there were like all these state organizations.
Who was the organizers of those?
I'm not quite sure. I think some of it was statewide. The way I got involved in Pennsylvania was somebody reached out to me because they had read some stuff I did and they saw me on television. So they said, "Can you join in?" And they had a Facebook page, and it was their own organization, a group that they just sort of came up with. And there's a big rally that's supposed to happen in September. So I think all of these statewide groups are going to band together in one big group to do a march in Washington in September. So it's sort of been a grassroots effort when this all started out in February, March, that they came up with this and then started doing sort of state chapters all over the place.
So do you think the Democratic Party is buying this as a as a campaign strategy, as a campaign slogan?
Well, I think they're wise to hit their start or whatever they can. And if this works, then more power to them. And I'll tell you why. Some people have argued that, no, there's not really a war on women. And, of course, John Boehner got up and really said this last week. Surprisingly enough, others have said it too, like Melissa Harris Perry. And I think this falls into the realm of a slogan like death panels to me. Okay, now the difference between death panels,
but there were no death panels.
Exactly, there were no death panels, right? But there is something concerted going on about the erosion of reproductive rights and other things that are going on in this country. And at no time have we had so much of a pushback on Roe v. Wade and other kinds of reproduction rights and just health care for women, period. So I do think that there's a concerted effort going on. Do you call it a war? Well, I think that if you want to call it a war and that helps people get mobilized behind it, yeah. And that's in the sense I can see it. To use a technicality that war is just like dropping bombs or something, I don't think that's helpful. What I do think is helpful for the Democrats, however, is that they need to speak to women. It is very clear that the same women in 2008 who were very much for Hillary Clinton, and there's 18 million grass clacks in the ceiling, find themselves in 2012 having their birth control maybe not being paid for, to have Planned Parenthood be reduced. All of these erosions are creating a real anxiety within for a lot of women, and a lot of women who don't have money, don't have the needs or resources that need to go to Planned Parenthood.
And the Republicans not wanting to reauthorize
the exactly.
Women Act, and not wanting to pass an Equal Pay Act, and
don't want to pass the violence on women.
Lilly Ledbetter.
I mean, it looks like a concerted effort to push women back to, and some people have been saying the 1950s, but I'm like, well, at least in the 1950s you could be a sex symbol. They don't even want you to be a sex symbol. I think this is like 1600. They're just supposed to drop babies. We're going to drop you over the side of the boat if you don't work.
Well, I think that the reason why the war on women phrase came about was because after the Obama administration released the regulation on the contraception coverage, the religious right called it a war on religion. Yeah. And so I think the counter argument was, there's not a war on religion, there's a war on women.
Exactly.
I guess I'm not opposed to the phrase. I certainly believe that there is an effort to undermine the gains that women have made in the last 50 years in the United States, and an effort to restrict their access to reproductive health care and so on. I'm not positive that the war on women phrase is an effective political phrase, and it's not because I don't think that the attack on, and I don't really like using that word either, but this effort to undermine women's health and women's rights, it's not because I don't think it's real. It's very, very real. But for some reason, the war on women phrase just politically doesn't appeal to me. It doesn't
hit you the same way.
Motivator. I don't know why. I can't really put my finger on it, but there's something to it that makes it seem like women are, not able to, it's sort of, there's a passivity.
There's an element of passivity to the title. Yeah, I could see how that would be. Yeah, but I mean, I think the other part of it is, and this is me. I'm going to jump into a very different mode here, which I don't often do, is to go back to my undergraduate years as a marketing major. It sells. Okay.
There you go. Yes.
It sells. It sells. I'm at Harrisburg on Saturday morning at 10:30. There were about 300 people standing on the Capitol steps with signs. And, that was more than I thought it would be. And that was great. I don't know what the turnout is around the country, but it obviously is something that people, on Facebook, on Twitter, and all these other things, it's very easy. You can say, wow, everybody knows what you're talking about. It's an organizing force. And so what I do think is for the Obama administration is that they have to figure out how they're going to harness it. I mean, I think he would probably do fairly well with women anyway, but it depends on what the pushback is going to be from the Republican Party, because for conservative women, they're going to say, there's no war on women, or as Phyllis Schlafly just said a week or two ago, I think, what she said, she's like, American women are treated the best in the whole wide world. And I was just like, man, that's Phyllis Schlafly. But, she has.
Well, that's the way the conservatives set it up. Yeah, exactly. They say, well, you're not restricted from driving like women are in Saudi Arabia, so you should be happy.
Well, exactly. You're not having as bad as as what Mona Eltahawy is saying. So it's bad. I think the other thing was, I think there's some interesting ways in which this is pushback, and I'll talk about something that happened yesterday on Meet the Press. What happened with Rachel Maddow and this interaction with Alex Castellanos, who's a Republican strategist. This doesn't have anything to do with religion, but it was really interesting because they were pushing back on her about this war on women language and attacks on women. And Alex was very condescending to Rachel Maddow. And I think what's going to happen is when you see more exchanges like the one that happened on Meet the Press yesterday with they finally have 2 or 3 women on Meet the Press after having a whole bunch of men for months and months and months on end, and then you have the only man on the show attack a woman, then it looks pretty suspect. And I
missed this.
It was amazing. So. I mean, Alex Castellanos was the rudest I've ever seen in my entire life, and plus it looks like he's been taking tanning tips from John Boehner, which is probably not a good thing. But Rachel Maddow obviously can hold her own. She had the facts there. It is becoming what I like to call the silly season now, because they're not facts, they're only hyperbole and big arguments to make all the way to the election day in November of 2012. But it seems to me that what is going to happen, what I think I can predict with this war on women language, is that this is only going to ratchet up. When you have the Catholic bishops making sorts of appeals to sort of put themselves in a certain kind of space, and I know we're going to talk about that soon.
Right.
And it's hard. Yeah. I mean, I think that the average woman who considers herself to be, moderately progressive or a liberal would say, yeah, I feel like it's a war. But let me say one more thing, and then we'll close it. If you could say there's a war on women, you could also have said there was a war on voting rights too, because I think this is a two-pronged thing, and they may not seem to be related. I
think that's much more explicit.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah. And there's been also this concerted effort to make sure people don't get to vote. I mean, for the last 2 or 3 years with all these different laws that have been changing and everything. So I think there's a vice that's happening, and that they're trying to peel off, women voters and just voters in particular. And how that will turn out in November will be very interesting to see.
Well, the way I have viewed this whole war on women versus war on religion story, because, I've been watching it for months, knowing that the bishops had complained in advance about the proposed contraception coverage rule, and knowing that if it went away, that they didn't want it to go, that they were going to protest mightily about it. So I knew that in advance. Most of the religion reporters and people who follow the activities of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops really closely, knew that this was coming down the pike even before it did.
Yeah.
And to me, the way it was framed up to begin with was, our religion needs to be given an exemption here. Our conscience requires an exemption from a law or regulation that otherwise applies, equally to everybody.
Yeah.
And so, to me, that they say that they're functioning on precedent about conscience protections that have been carved out over time for religious objectors to laws. I see it as they're trying to expand those supposed exemptions or protections so that they can, that they are, it's not that their religion is accommodated by law. They want their religion to dictate what the law says.
Exactly.
And so, to me, that is really not, yes, what's behind it is this, the theology of the Catholic Church is obviously behind it. Their what Grant Galicia last week with me called their preoccupation with feminism, the need to continue to promote Humanae Vitae, and just the whole general theology of sex of the Catholic Church is obviously behind it, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
At its core, and maybe this, maybe the marketing major in you can tell me that this isn't a good seller, but to me it's more of a, if you want to even use the war phraseology, which I don't even like, but it's like a war on the First Amendment. It's part of a broader strategy to change how the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause intersect and play with each other.
Exactly.
Or interact with each other.
Exactly.
And to me, that has far wider implications for our politics and our society and the separation of church and state than just focusing on this being a war on women. And I think that, I guess what troubles me about the phrase war on women is that to me it seems like a little bit of a political ploy because women are seen as this voting demographic that need to be specially reached out to, or their buttons get pushed in a different way than men. And so of course always when exit polls or polling data are broken down, obviously like it is broken down by gender and religion and everything else and race. But I guess that's to me like it, because this whole thing about needing to have the law be crafted to accommodate religion is a much broader thing that should be troubling to everyone.
Yeah, no, that's exactly
but maybe it isn't troubling to everyone, and maybe that's why the Democrats aren't focusing.
Well, I think part of it is about how you articulate the arguments, right? I mean, what the argument is being buried in the hyperbole once again. So what you just said is really important. Well, the average person doesn't know that. The average person doesn't get. They just know I can't get my birth control paid for, right? This is bad. I mean, they know Sandra Fluck. They know this other piece. But they don't know that there's an underlying fundamental argument about separation of church and state. And the argument about, free exercise was supposed to be, it's the right to worship. It's not the right to tell people what they are not going to pay for. In terms of that. And if it's
that's one of their arguments that and somebody, I can't remember who it was, I think one of the writers at Commonweal last week had this great piece sort of dissecting how the right has claimed that Obama has reduced this to the right to worship when it's really sort of a broader right to freely practice your religion. Yeah. And it's true. It's not just, the First Amendment, the Free Exercise Clause does not just protect your right to actually, go into church and worship.
Yeah, exactly.
A right broader than that. But it doesn't entitle you to impose your religious beliefs through policy or legislation.
Exactly. And so this is going to be the problem because, I mean, in a way, if you took that argument out, if they want to impose it, then what they could say is basically, well, we're not going to hire anybody but good Catholics in a hospital because
they can't. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's another thing, I guess, that Obama has decided doesn't have high priority for him. So last week on Friday, late Friday afternoon or evening news dump, the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships released, this additional guidance on crafting regulations that would that are designed to beef up the constitutional safeguards when the government gives taxpayer money to a faith-based organization to deliver services to people. And, I haven't even had a chance to even read the documents yet. But my understanding from talking to some civil liberties groups is that, again, the Obama administration has decided not to address this question of the faith-based hiring. And so, just to give a little history of this, so under Bush, when he created the faith-based office, he issued an executive order that said, if you're a faith-based organization, even if you're receiving federal funds, you may it didn't use this word. You may discriminate in hiring hiring or firing employees. So basically, even if an organization is getting money from the federal government, taxpayer money from the federal government, it can decide that it only wants to hire co-religionists.
Okay.
So it could say, well, we're only hiring evangelical Christians. Or it could decide, we're not going to hire a lesbian because that goes against our religious beliefs. Homosexuality is against our religious beliefs. So it basically entitles them to discriminate based on religion, even though they're receiving federal funds.
Exactly.
Obama promised on the campaign trail in 2008 to get rid of that rule, to change that rule, and then changed his mind after pressure from evangelical and other leaders who said that they didn't even want to have a faith-based office at all if this co-religionist, as they call it, co-religionist hiring isn't in place. And so I think that civil libertarian and church-state separation advocacy groups are still very, very troubled that this is still going on under Obama. And, you know, again, this is one of these areas where, you know, people aren't paying that much attention to it, yet somehow anti-abortion groups make a lot of hay out of the non-existent federal funding of abortion in the Affordable Care Act, for example.
Exactly.
You know, even though it's barred by the Hyde Amendment, yet somehow the traction, the political traction to say, hey, you know, federal funds, your taxpayer dollars go to these faith-based organizations, and they can decide that if they're Christian, they don't want to hire a Muslim, or they can fire a single mother because they think that's wrong and it goes against their religion. Or, I mean, imagine the different scenarios that it allows them to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think some of these issues pertaining to church-state separation, either they don't get traction or there's no political will to give them traction. And I wonder why.
Well, I think it's because partially people don't get into the arguments too deep. That's one thing. And second, I have to be honest with you and say, I think it's a media piece. I mean, everybody wants just the big takeaway or whatever the big fight is of the day. So like when the ISA hearings happened, it was about the hearings, and we didn't get too deep into the intricacies of these issues. And I think that's a real problem, because nobody's asking, you know, the important questions about this. Now, I'll say that I think one of the things that could help in doing this is if people start to push back on some of this with some of the issues that have been in churches. For example, you know, if we talk about the Catholic Church, you push back and you say, well, look at the, you know, pedophilia, look at how much money this has cost the church, look at how this has changed. You know, if you're going to limit this, you know, if you're going to be able to limit to people who only worship in this particular faith, then you're going to have to do some other things in order to, you know, be equal for all, right? So that's a problem. So I think once you start to talk about discrimination, you have to be able to push back on these organizations that's due, first of all. Second, this is kind of an interesting case that hasn't really gotten a lot of play, but I think it should, and it's at my alma mater, Vanderbilt University, which has basically said, yeah. And I think this is actually an interesting way to look at this in another way, where they're saying, we don't care. You could be of any tradition whatsoever. We're not going to limit, say, the Vanderbilt Catholic community to just Catholics anymore. And so in the Vanderbilt Catholic community, they've actually moved off campus. And
well, these are the official,
there's a judgment that's over
groups,
the group right now. And they've moved off campus, but Vanderbilt has told them now that they can't call themselves the Vanderbilt Catholic community if they're off Vanderbilt campus. In order to, you know, so what they're doing is moving so that they don't have to have any officers who aren't Catholic. Let's say somebody who's Jewish or, you know, a Baha'i or whatever wants to come join the Vanderbilt Catholic community. They could be a part of it. They can be, you know, they can be an officer if they get elected, all of this stuff. And so this has created a lot of tension within the Vanderbilt community. So that's the other side of this, you know, where, where you open it up to everybody.
A similar issue has already been taken up by the Supreme Court, you know, similar issue.
Yeah.
Being the case in the Hastings College of Law and the Christian Legal Society. So that case involved the Christian Legal Society, which required a statement of faith and a sexual purity pledge. And they couldn't get an official school club or group designation because it prohibited. The school said it was against their anti-discrimination policy, which prohibited discrimination against people based on sexual orientation. And that policy of the school, you know, not giving the group the official sanction because it violated the school's anti-discrimination policy. That did not violate the group's free exercise rights. Like when the free exercise rights came up against this anti-discrimination policy, it was okay for the school to say, look, you have to, if you want the official sanction of the school, and say, you're an official school group, you've got to adhere to our anti-discrimination policy. And but I do think that these sorts of different variations on that theme of these Christian college and other school groups is going to continue, because I think that some of the religious right legal organizations are continuing to push these sorts of cases as part of the alleged war against religion, or war on Christianity, or however they phrase it, which is another reason why I wish there was some other way of framing this whole thing other than the war on women, because again, this has broader implications, and because it's not just that if the Catholic Church had been successful in getting these even broader exemptions than the Obama administration had given it in the rule, and in the accommodation, which basically, allows this other kind of contractual arrangement so that a self-insuring Catholic organization wouldn't have to actually be involved in providing the contraception coverage. If they had been successful in that in crafting an even broader exemption than that, say the exemption they later claimed they wanted, the Taco Bell exemption, which basically was the Blunt Amendment that was defeated in the Senate, that has very broad implications beyond depriving women who work at Catholic organizations of contraception coverage. And so I think that people really have to think about it in terms of what the end goal of the people who are claiming that there's a war on religion is.
Exactly.
And it's much, much more than just getting religious organizations out of the requirement that they cover their employees' contraception.
Well, I just basically think that it's not even a war on religion anymore. It's religion's war on the U.S. government. I'd rather say it that way, because I think that's what it really is. And maybe the basic question at the bottom of this is, do we want to be a theocracy or not? And that's really the fundamental issue, because all of these things have some religious connotation. And if I were an atheist, I would be really upset, I'd have to say, because I think that the kinds of things that are happening here, whether it's, against women, the Catholic bishops trying to do all this stuff, it is basically them trying to impose their will on what is, the government. And if we really do believe Thomas Jefferson and the Danbury Association letter to the church to say there's the separation, blah, 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 then I don't think people came here for it to be another England with a state church, but everybody's really trying to have a state church. But the state church here in America right now is some kind of hybrid Catholic evangelical religious sort of milieu, where, you have rights about, there's no abortion, there's no this, there's no that, and all these things are rescinded. And I think
that's what they would like. I think what happens from a political standpoint is that they want to carve out, like we were talking about just before with the contraception, they want to carve out exceptions. So if something like the Blunt Amendment had passed, so this would give an incredibly broad exemption to any kind of employer. So the reason I brought up the Taco Bell thing was the General Counsel for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, during the period between the issuance of the contraception rule and the time that the Obama announced the accommodation, we're basically saying, he came out and said, I think he told USA Today that, this is really much bigger than that. What if you were a Taco Bell franchise owner and you didn't want to provide this sort of coverage? And so that's what the Blunt Amendment would have done. It would have allowed any employer, so say your employer, you're the CEO of some private company, but you yourself are religious and you don't in some way, and you don't want to provide a certain kind of coverage because it goes against your religious values. It could, extend to anything, drug treatment coverage or what have you. But that's the sort of, I think that I think that people tend to think in these sort of like black and white terms, and that there's secular government and then there's a theocracy, and we have to stop them from imposing a theocracy. And I think that we're nowhere near that.
No, we're not
and
near
in fact,
that.
But I think that the idea of carving out greater and greater exemptions creates sort of this two kinds of rules.
Yes, exactly.
And enables people to, de facto impose their religious beliefs by having these exemptions from the requirements that apply to everybody else.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it's neither what was envisioned by the Free Exercise Clause or the Establishment Clause. It's like some weird new thing that they're really trying to
and
to make bigger.
Yeah, and I mean all of that plus this. I mean, they're big giant lobby groups now. I mean, they're not religious organizations. They act like lobbyists, and I think there was a Pew thing recently.
They are lobbyists,
they're lobbying. Tax them.
And they don't have to if they're a religious organization. They're exempt from the requirements of the Lobbying Disclosure Act, so they're not subject to the same transparency as corporate lobbyists are.
Yeah.
And Pew did actually a really helpful report. I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, about the growth of religious lobbying. And they based it, they collected the information. I think there were some that did file lobbying disclosure reports, but they used other evidence of lobbying to put together this overview of the growth of religious-based lobbying in Washington over the past, however, I can't remember, 10 or 20 years. And it's really grown exponentially, and it really tells you a lot about where some of this political will to carry on these sorts of extended discussions of whether the contraception coverage violates people's religious freedom and so on. And there's plenty of religious lobbying that's perfectly just mundane and just advancing the interests of a particular group that might want to see healthcare reform passed and just having their voices heard. But there's a lot more to it than that.
A lot more.
So on that, I just wanted to sort of maybe bring us around on the Catholic stuff. So the bishops have this Fortnight for Freedom planned, and I've been talking to Catholics sort of just conversationally, casually, but also professionally, and it just seems like the reaction of most Catholics is, "Huh? Really? They're really going to do this?" I mean, what's your sense? Do you think that this 20 days in June and July leading up to Independence Day is really going to bring Catholics out of the parishes and into this greater fight for religious freedom?
Let me say it as strongly as I can. Hell to the nah, as Whitney Houston would say, God rest her soul. No, no, no. And let me tell you why. I think about the Philadelphia context right now. What brought Catholics out into the street in Philadelphia? School closures. Okay? I mean, it's really, when I saw the letter and this whole Fortnight for Freedom thing, I started laughing because I was just like, my God, what are they trying to do? Take Family Research Council's thing and like do something for a change? So they take one of their old letters from like back in the 1980s? It was such an old, antiquated idea, first of all. And then secondarily, I was like, you act as if there's some monolithic Catholic Church. And there is not. And this is what I think the bishops have forgotten. They may move as a very slow-moving, shaggy, woolly mammoth, but the rest of us are going, are you joking? There's no Fortnight for Freedom. We're not doing this. We've got school closings. Here in Philadelphia, we've got this big, giant pedophilia case. And I think people are just really tapped out with the bishops, quite honestly. And the reason why is in part that it's just the parishes, many local parishes either had to close or in the process of thinking about closing. There's a lot of healthy parishes in this country. Some are politically active, some are not. And it's this fortnight of freedom thing sort of collided with the Vatican ruling on the nuns council. And so you've got this two-pronged thing happening. You've got this, we're going to fight out in the streets for freedom, but at the same time, we're going to shut these nuns down who are doing things we don't like, and they're being feminist, and they're helping the poor, and they're doing stuff. And we want them to come out and fight in the street, too, for the things that we want them to. They need to be on our program and not their program. And I think for the average Catholic person, you're just like, who the hell are these guys? Who are these people? And this is not, I mean, it has never been that kind of a thing. It just hasn't been.
Here's a question. So I think that, some of this that's been going on has led to some kind of reductionist formulations about what's going on internally in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And so I very rarely watch Hardball, but sometimes, mainly because I'm still working when
he's on.
It's on. But the other day I was watching it, and Chris Matthews said, I think he had Sister Simone Campbell from Network on, and he had James Salt from Catholics United. And he says to them, so why is it that it seems that all the bishops are Republicans and all the nuns are Democrats? And it was funny because I tweeted it because I just thought it was sort of classic Chris Matthews. Like, I have this idea that it seems right, so
I'm going to say it, and I'm going to keep pushing it until I can't anymore.
And my Twitter followers seemed to really enjoy it. Like, it seemed to encapsulate their view of what's going on here. The bishops are all Republicans, and the besieged nuns are all Democrats. Yeah. And Peter Mansow, who knows quite a bit about nuns and Catholicism, said, that's just not. It's just not that simple.
No, it's not that simple.
But I think that because the bishops' conference and the crackdown on the nuns actually is coming from Rome, not from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops.
It's coming from Rome, but there's a Catholic bishop who's in charge of it from Seattle, and that's the issue.
Well, so here's the thing. So you have the bishops speaking in this very strong, apparently unified voice about the war on religion and the fortnight for freedom, and religious freedom is under siege, right? And you have Bishop Laurie, who gets this big promotion to be Bishop of Baltimore because he's done such a good job on the ad hoc committee on religious freedom, and that just seems like there they are, they're all together on this. And then you have, say, the Paul Ryan business, where you have all this kind of, Paul Ryan. And John Boehner writes the letter to Dolan and says, will you say something about this? And, he kind of writes this is last year, he kind of writes this letter that's like, oh, well, I commend your interest in the social justice teaching, and you would really want to do this and do that, and, preferential option for the poor. But, he doesn't write this letter that says, this is terrible.
Yeah, no, of course he's not going to write that letter.
Like they do with him. Yeah. And then you have from the various, to the various House committees, you have these 4 different letters from the bishops about the budget. And so why is that? Why is it that on the sex and the religious freedom and the intersection of those two things, are they speaking on this in this incredibly decisive, uniform, black and white, everything is black and clearly black and white voice? And then when it comes to this question of the budget, which will, if Paul Ryan's budget passed, it would so clearly and immediately affect so many more people's lives negatively than anybody's religious freedom is infringed. So why is it that they're kind of tiptoeing around that?
Yeah.
And so firm on the other thing, is it because they are Republicans? Or is it just because those issues, the sex stuff matters more?
Well, I think the sex stuff matters more globally. Let's put it like that. Because it's all about the culture of life stuff. And that, but at the same time, I would say that they have been adamant about Ryan's budget is bad. They just haven't spent it as strongly as they should have. Let's put it like that.
But why?
Well, I think it's in part because they're too in bed right now with the Republican Party. I mean, that's my take. I mean, they want the Republican Party to fight this religious freedom, battle for them about sexuality and everything, and they see themselves in that.
And
but
is
that
why they're being so soft on Ryan?
Well, I think that they're not. Let me put it like this: I don't know if I would call it soft. I would call it, this is the disconnect between, and now we're going to go theological for a minute. This is the disconnect between how people misunderstand the Catholic theology in terms of, you could be this very strong on this one thing and then say, but we want this preferential option for the poor, both of which are inherent for Catholic theology. Now, for Ryan to sit there, this is the other thing that really ticked me off, and I brought this up yesterday when I was on Melissa Harris Perry, for Ryan to say, this is what I think. Of course, he's leading off with his conscience when he talks at Georgetown. And then he talks about Aquinas and all this in his reading and his understanding of what's going on. So he's pushing back at the bishops, first of all, for that one. And secondly, he's saying, but look, this comes out of my reading of Catholic theology. And, as one of my dear friends said, who's a priest, he said, look, the real problem is that American Catholics are just really Protestants in disguise. This is the problem.
Are they really what?
They're really Protestants in disguise. And that they've been so corrupted, they don't even know what being a real Catholic is anymore. So they latch on to all these things that are sort of the evangelical talking points because they can get traction in the media and everything else for that. Hopefully it'll help everybody forget about the other bad stuff that's going on. And then for the things that are really inherently Catholic, like, we want to be against the war, and we're not going to, we want peace, and we want to feed the poor, and we want to think about poverty and all those things. They can't even deal with that. And so what I think the difference is between, to sort of go back to this formulation that Chris had about the nuns being Democrats and the bishops being Republicans, is that I think the nuns know how to do nuance better than the bishops do. And the bishops don't do nuance very well. What they do is they like to pontificate and make statements. The nuns are doing. And that's the difference between, what each of these entities are getting at. So in a way, there's nobody pulling back on the Catholic bishops to say to them, you're being too political right now. That's not coming from the Vatican, because all that's coming to them is that they're pushing forward the kinds of things that, the Vatican would be in favor of, the Pope would be in favor of, a right to life, all this stuff, no birth control, all these things are Catholic teachings. But poverty is also a Catholic teaching about doing well for the poor. But I don't think they really care about the poor. And you have to understand how bishops live, okay? Most of them have a very nice house. A lot of them have a driver. They get to drink whatever they want every day. They get free tickets to stuff. Dolan is living like a king in New York City while parishes close. So there's a reason why they call the cardinals princes of the church, okay? Because they are princes. They live like princes for the most part. There are very few bishops that, drive themselves to do everything. I hear Chaput does that in Philadelphia, so I put my hats off to him. There may be one time my hat is off to him. But for the most part, they have people to staff them every day. They don't cook their meals. Somebody cooks for them. You have to understand, these people are so removed from poverty, they don't give a damn about anybody impoverished. So to ask a bishop to think about the poor in America, I don't even know how they do it. I hate to put it in an argument like that, but I do think that I think that it's really, I think that there's some kind of way in which people who aren't Catholic don't understand how well Catholic bishops really live. So, when Lori gets a position in Baltimore, you have to understand that comes with, you could fly to Rome when you need to, you get a car, you get all this stuff. You are sitting on top of money. And so it's a very powerful position. So like anybody else who would have that position, I don't know that I expect them to have a preferential option for the poor. Clearly they don't. And last thing, a lot of this got beaten out of the church in the 80s and the 90s with the killing liberation theology. Now, granted, there's a different kind of bishop. Everybody has to really understand that what John Paul II was about was not, everybody loved him in one way, but in another way, he was about dismantling some of these things that happened with Vatican II. One way you dismantle is you start to put in, really conservative bishops, and you put in conservative cardinals. And this is what has happened. You are seeing that what is happening today is the outgrowth of what started in the 80s. And that I think, it's hard for people to understand sort of the historical lens. But that's what's the problem.
But you're saying on the one hand, they're becoming more orthodox in the sense that they're, they've gone past Vatican II. They got rid of liberation theology and all of that crazy commie stuff. And And so, but at the same time, and they're becoming more doctrinaire on issues relating to sex and sexuality.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're saying they've abandoned Catholic teaching on the
that's what I'm saying. And I know it sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's more important for them to regulate uteruses and penises than it is to feed the mouths of the poor.
Well, that's a quote for the ages. So let me ask you this. So there's been a lot of discussion about Ross Douthat's book, which bemoans the loss of orthodoxy in Christian orthodoxy in particular, in American society. But, and he essentially makes the argument, truth be told, I haven't read the book yet, but I've, read interviews with him and some of the reviews of it. But he seems to be making an argument that the subtitle of the book is A Nation of Heretics, yeah. I think. It's called Bad Religion. Mm-hmm. And, I know he's been on Blogging Heads with Bob and talked about that now. Yeah. In contemporary America, Christians are too focused on wealth, and there's need to be less of a focus on that. And he takes particular umbrage, I think, at the prosperity gospel, and who wouldn't really. I think a lot of people wouldn't. But anyway, between you and me, yeah, we wouldn't.
We take it.
But it's interesting because, I think that one person's orthodoxy is another person's heresy.
Exactly.
Because, who's to say what the heresy is and what the orthodoxy is?
Exactly. I mean, I have to say, Douthat bothers me on several levels, and I will just say this out loud because I just feel like, maybe if he's watching Blogging Heads, he'll hear this. It's not about heresy. It's about your bad historian, Ross. You're a terrible religious historian, okay? And all of us who are American religious historians looked at that book and just went, what in the hell is he talking about? It was just bad history to not realize that there's always been heretical sorts of things. You don't come up with, Mormonism or all these other kinds of religious traditions unless you have a healthy, people thinking about what these religious traditions are. There have always been heretics. I mean, the reason why heretics don't win is because people who had authority knocked them down. I mean, there may be a 66.
Well, is heresy bad even?
Yeah, and it's not even bad all the time. That's the whole point. I mean, in that I think, this is his naivete in a sense to sort of bemoan something that has never existed in this country. He wants an ideal. He's an ideologue. And I think that by, sort of writing the book this way, he just misses the point about America. In the first place, there's always been a contention between sort of heretical kinds of religious belief and orthodoxy. And sometimes orthodoxy isn't very orthodox either. And that's what he can't see past. Right. So he's got a monolithic idea about what he thinks religion is. And I want to go back to this op-ed that he wrote about, he says, and there was this glorious time, and this is a few weeks back when he talked about Martin Luther King, that, people could believe in the civil rights movement because they believed everything else. And they believed all in the same thing. And I'm like, do you understand that Martin Luther King didn't even believe that Jesus was the Son of God? I mean, it was like amazing to me that he just didn't even know
that not everyone was far from it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, this like fantasy land, what he's done with this book. I mean, I'm happy that he's able to publish a book that can, tout so many things about what he thinks when they're just obviously wrong. But on the other hand, what I think it does is it plays into this sort of ideology. And I'm also going to say something else too that I think, is worth saying here. He is a convert. And whenever you have somebody who converts from one thing to another thing, they want it to be pure. Converts are always idealizing what that tradition is. And he's a convert into Catholicism. He has idealized what he thinks the Catholic Church is supposed to be through readings, his experiences. Most of the people who are coming into the Catholic Church in the last 3 to 5 years have been really more on the conservative side than they have been on the liberal side. So in that sense, I'm not surprised that he would write a book like this. What is surprising to me is that he has such a poor misreading of American religious history. What I would like to do is offer to him, some of us like Steve Prothero or I, whatever, if you want to come and sit in on any of our classes anytime, I welcome you. But I promise you, I will grade you very difficultly. And if you send that book that you sent to me, it's probably going to be an F. It was just, it has a core of an interesting idea in it. It just is not produced well. And that's what I think is the truth about it, honestly.
Well,
Yeah, that's like, yeah, I know. I would not, I have to just say, I was not going to mince words about it. I mean, I feel like
there's no
that
need
he's
to mince
pushing
words about
a
it.
particular ideology that is just historically inaccurate, and that if he really wants to look at what American religion really is, he needs to start from scratch, and that is not what is appearing in his book.
Also, I think that, to me, the idea of heresy, the idea that you even talk about heretics and phrase it that way is a dangerous idea.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that somebody can decide that somebody else is a heretic. I mean, for persecuted religious minorities, that's a scary idea that somebody sits there and decides who the heretics are.
Yeah, exactly. And I would hate it to be him, because I don't think he has enough, of theologically going on or historically going on that he could decide who's a heretic and who's not. He can decide who he feels like is a heretic, and obviously has the right to write the book. But for him to have an understanding of that, he'd burn some people at the stake and be sorry for it afterwards.
Why?
He'd make a good inquisitor, though. I give him that much. He's got a good inquisitor vibe around him. I could see him turning the rack on some of us any day. Thankfully, he only gets to turn the rack in the op-ed section, and we can choose to turn the page.
Well, I think on that note, maybe we'll wrap this up, just because I think we've been going maybe longer than we even anticipated we would.
Yeah, but anyway, I'm not hating. I'm just saying bad book. As an academic, I have to say bad book. It's not good.
Well, listen, it was great to talk to you about all these things.
Good to talk to you too, Sarah. Take care.
Bye.